Do we have to push these on or anything? Nope. Okay. Well, thanks.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hi. You and my mom.
No audio?
And my wife. Sorry, baby. Do you have any sound, Julian? Or
No,
not,
no audio.
or it's supposed to be audio.
You're supposed to be doing the sound effects.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm sure most of you probably have seen that trailer already, and like me, you're kind of intrigued about what Irrational's cooking up this time with Bioshock Infinite. My name's Julian Murdoch, and I'm pleased to be the guy up here asking a few questions before you guys get your shot. Today we have with us four of the folks from Irrational Games who are building the world of Bioshock Infinite, the city of Columbia. This guy's Ken Levine.
If you think that picture's douchey, wait till you see his picture. It's way douchier.
Ken's the co-founder, creative director of Irrational Games, and he led the creation of Bioshock and has a storied career before that that really doesn't need much introduction. Nate.
God, I love that picture. So sexy.
Nate Wells started out as a level
What's going on
builder.
with the hand there, Nate? That's what I want to know.
Cutscene artist, and of all things, a voice actor, which I guess comes with the hamminess. He started at Looking Glass Studios' Thief the Dark project back in 1997, and joined Irrational for their first project, a little thing called System Shock 2. He's since contributed art direction to numerous titles, including SWAT 4 and Bioshock, and currently serves as art director on Bioshock Infinite. Sean Robertson started working on... He started working back in the 8-bit era in 1995 and was part of the team at Looking Glass that put together the Flight Unlimited series. Thank you, my favorite ever. And ultimately landed at Irrational in 2000, where he was the lead animator on Bioshock and is currently lead artist on Bioshock Infinite. And last, we have Stephen Alexander.
Looks so happy, Steve.
Steven started on the arcade side of the business, working on Golden Tee Golf and other games before landing at Irrational in 2006. On Bioshock, he was the special effects artist, working on all that gorgeous water and plasmids and weapons and explosions and the like, and he serves a similar role here on Bioshock Infinite. So the topic of today's session sounds pretty grandiose, building games as main characters, but as anyone who's played Irrational games before knows, they are often intimately tied to places, whether that's an underwater city or a faster-than-light starship. We're going to talk today about the place in which Bioshock Infinite is set, the city of Columbia, where it's come from, how it's grown, and how it plays a role in the story of Bioshock Infinite. As we're chatting, and you're not going to listen to me, you're listening to these guys, I'll try to keep up and show some examples of what we're talking about on the screen. So Ken, let's maybe start with you. You decided Bioshock Infinite was going to take place in an alternate version of 1912, and you came up with this idea for, let me skip forward. Technical errors already.
Pull it together, Murdoch.
I know.
Wait for it.
This was the idea, right?
So this image was left on my desk.
Really, that's all there is to it, right?
This was left stuck to my desk by Scott Sinclair, who's right here in the front row. He's the principal level builder on Bioshock Infinite and the art director of Bioshock 1. And this was placed on my desk to clarify my job for the next 3 years.
It's the official passing of the torch.
Yeah, actually it elucidates a lot of things about the game design process. We may come back to this slide.
But so Ken, maybe you could take us from where you go after this napkin. I mean, where you have this idea, city in the sky.
Yeah.
How do you start turning that into a character? How do you start building that world?
We started. I think we sort of started. We had a long period to figure out what we were going to do next after Bioshock 1, and we were fortunate that we had that chance to sit around, and we had our sort of our core creative group in a room, and we were sort of going back and forth on all these ideas. We prototyped a bunch of different things. I'm sure you all heard a bunch of things people thought we were doing or may not have been doing, but we tried to do a lot of different things. And we were sitting around one day, we couldn't agree on anything. And Stephen Alexander actually said, well, what if we were to do a Bioshock game, but it wasn't like the other Bioshock game? What if it was like totally different? What if we basically threw out all the rules? And all these like jerks who can't agree on anything, who're sitting around a room, all of a sudden sat up and said, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea, Steve. And and that happened so rarely, we knew right away that was the thing we wanted to do. And we just, so we started talking about historical periods we were interested in, and we all really tuned into the turn of the century because there was a certain optimism, and as compared to like Rapture, which is so dark and so and so ominous feeling, we started to say, well, what if we had something that felt more optimistic, right from the start? And we started thinking of, there was if you look at the art of the time, especially the speculative science fiction art, there was always a sense that people would be living in the clouds, because I think there was an incredible sense that, they had all this change of technology in the 20 years preceding that. Electricity just came on, telephones just came on, movies just came on, cars just came on, airplanes just came on in like a 20-year period. You think about our lives, the only thing that's happened like that in the last 20 years on that scale is the internet. They had like 7, 10 internets in that period of time. And if you ask somebody, back then, might we be living in the clouds in 10 years? They might have thought, they might have said, yeah, maybe we might be. So you see a ton of art from that period about cities in the sky.
So Nate, maybe you could continue there. I mean, so you have these conversations, you start sketching, you start looking at stuff from the period. How do you get your hands around what Columbia looks like?
Well, the first thing that happened, that was like a 10-minute meeting.
Yeah.
It literally was, so everybody, turn of the century, city in the sky, let's go.
Yeah.
And, we left that room, and, of course, the next day you have to deal with the consequences of that decision. So, our process at Irrational, we kind of split at that point. Ken goes off and he's sort of delving into, political thought and, social issues of the time. And we immediately start digging into, period architecture, period photography. if any of you know Shorpy.com, it is a limitless resource of history. And you know, it became clear in about 5 minutes of looking through source material that this was going to work really, really well, and it was also going to be incredibly difficult to pull off.
When you think about like some of the other source material, like we passed around the book Devil in a White City, and we started talking about the Chicago World Fair 1893 and the sense of optimism and the amount of just, you know, inventions that were created for 1893, and it just adds so much to the palette that we can bring to the table.
In fact, that was one of the reasons why the period, we both read Devil in the White City. You guys should definitely read it. It's great. It's sort of a recounting of the building of the Chicago World's Exposition. Also tells a story of America's first serial killer at the same time.
And one of the very first sketches that Nate did actually was almost a World's Fair treatment.
Yeah.
Like that was one of the, like we're going like a lot of different directions initially, like just kind of feeling it out. And you did like a woodcut that looked like a white city.
Yeah, there would be like posters from, you know, a flying city exposition. And we moved away from that to a large degree, but we all shared that same starting point, which is really important. So we go away, and the narrative is sort of taking shape, and the art is sort of taking shape. And I think you admit we both kind of go down divergent paths and try things that maybe don't necessarily make it to the game. I mean, I think that's part of what we're talking about today is we start someplace and then end up someplace different. And really, that's because we need to keep the environment of the game an integral part of the story. So if the story changes, which it always does, and it always changes from that meeting, it'll change over the next year until we gel and end up with what you see basically in that reel. We have to change our world. We have to keep it consistent. So Ken's writing one thing, and talk about like where you first landed with narrative.
Yeah, well, we were having I think we were having a bit of a challenge finding out what was driving the city philosophically. You know, I think we had that, and it took us a long time with Bioshock 1 too. And we had a period where we didn't have the whole American exceptionalism thing that you see in the trailer there. For a while, it was very much a story about technologists versus Luddites.
Yeah, and that came a lot from, like you were saying, those very initial source images that we found of like sort of what people thought the future would look like. It was so technology oriented.
Yeah.
It was so much about like what is the technology of now projected out, and they were so optimistic about that technology that we thought that's where the story probably was.
I think we just didn't find that conflict that interesting after a period of time. Like we kept saying, well, there was, you know, okay, we're gonna have this, that, but nothing really gelled around it. And so I watched a documentary called America 1900, and it's like one of these American Experience documentaries. I'm a bit of a documentary nerd. You know, I watch a lot of documentaries, and that makes me a really interesting guy, trust me. All of a sudden, there's all these elements that, you know, I hadn't tuned into. I was still tuning into the period, and I started reading these things about, I started watching this documentary, things about what was going on. I knew what was going on technologically, but I didn't fully tune into what was going on historically, which was this just amazing period that people don't know that much about, where America was transforming from this like small little regional power that was really anti-imperialist because we were part of an empire 100 years before that. And you know, that was really in our corner of the world, but we were getting so strong economically that we started to take our place on the world stage for good and for bad. And so we already had this tenet of optimism about technology, and we already had a bookend for that technology, for the optimism of that technology going, the dark side of that being World War I, where all of a sudden all this industrialization and all these incredible tools gets turned against us. You know, if you think about the meat grinder that was World War I, then we also started to have this optimism about America and America's role in the world. And if you study that period, we started getting involved in places like Cuba. We started getting involved in places like the Philippines, which had some good parts of an outcome and some very dark parts of the outcome. And that tension about what was the role of America on the world and what was the role of technology and people with very different views, all those things sort of came together. And all of a sudden, like the phrase July 4th, 1912, came into my head. And
That was a real, I think, aha moment for the art team when you sat down and you were you pitched us this idea of American exceptionalism, and immediately just the images in our mind of what we could do with that and where we could go with creating a world that was based around that was floating in the sky. I mean, that for me, I remember that being a true turning point for I know exactly where we're going with this now.
And that's always a good moment when you can come in and tell the team something and they can all understand what you're saying, because I think we had a lot of problems before of well, what is this world? What are the technologists like? What are the Luddites like? But when we said, there's this side that believes in this. It's what it's like is people think they remember America was like at that period of time, which it probably wasn't at all. But it's that memory of what people think existed at the time. That's what this world looks like on the most surface level, and that's what we try to show with that trailer, is really to show what this optimistic vision of the world is, and then start introducing as we go on and we talk more about the game. You'll see the forces that are pulling it apart as well.
Right, and a lot of the narrative ideas that came in the interim before Ken locked that in, before that popped into his head, you hear a lot of things and you're trying to move on them, but the reason you can't move on them is they're the wrong idea. You just don't know it yet. And when you came in with that, I remember you pitched it to it at our desks, and it really felt like we could just turn around and start working. Yep. And we hadn't had that feeling for months. We'd been kicking around, maybe the narrative will go this way, maybe it'll go that way. And when you get the right one, I think, all of us were like, oh, okay, we know exactly how to do that.
I mean, there were almost too many things that fit the other idea. You could go almost any direction with it, and it was reasonable. But with this,
right. And this point of the direction for the architecture, the characters, the lighting, everything, everything sort of came at once. We were able to visualize a world that fit this narrative perfectly.
Yeah, I think
supported it.
I think also because we had used Art Deco in Bioshock, and that was so influential for us, we tuned into the style, the sort of the outsider style of the time, which was Art Nouveau, and we're like, okay, we're just going to sub in Art Nouveau, but it wasn't doing anything for us. We still have a lot of Art Nouveau elements in the game, but that is the primary visual element, just wasn't doing anything for us in terms of helping us tell our story.
Right, and that's where you end up digging too deep into the source material because you don't have your own narrative yet.
Yep.
So you keep digging into the source and digging in, and a lot of that stuff will ship, which is great, and it gives the city a layered texture because you see the aesthetic we started with and the one we finished with, and they mesh just like a city aging over time. It looks like a 20-year-old city rather than one that was just born. Yeah. It's one of the side benefits of not having your mind made up at the beginning or not knowing what you're doing when you start.
That is an interesting point.
Is what you're saying.
That is an interesting point that you bring up. Having this conversation with Nate about the way real cities are made. Not every building is made at the same time in a city. So when you have cities that are actually built in games with one style and then you move over closer to another style, it may not be the most efficient way to work, but you actually start creating a history inside of your city through the mere act of just exploring what your aesthetic is.
Mm-hmm. So you end up with your first visions of, this is really what it's going to kind of look like. And I looked at this image, and this sort of is the first one that I saw in this stack of stuff you showed me, where it's like, okay, this is what we're starting to see. This is starting to feel like the story. How does starting to see these kinds of images come out of the art team impact what you're doing with the story, Ken? I mean, is this a reflexive loop where all of a sudden you're like, oh, I see what they did there. Now I can take the whole story in a different direction because I see how the world's working?
No, I think for me, we tuned in so much on the same page at this point. Like when we do this image like this, from this point it was mostly like, let's talk about the color of the sky, and move away from purples and more into light, into July 4th blue. And it happened so quickly from this point, from here. I mean, how long was this before we actually did the demo that we showed?
Yeah, I was a decent amount of time. It helped point the direction. If you go back to that previous slide, if you want to,
this one. This
is where we were.
I was just going to say, as an example of sort of the difference,
Because this is a city in the sky, but one thing that I like about this image is that this is our first stab at City in the Sky, but it still feels a little like Rapture because it's claustrophobic, it's dark, it's closed in. So even though we put this building in the clouds, it's a step forward, but it's not a step far enough.
So how do you make the decision to go from something like this, which, I mean, I look at this not as an artist, but just as a gamer, and I'm like, this looks really cool. How do you make the bridge from this to where you ended up?
Well, I think that's the point. There's lots of things that look really cool. We could go 50 different directions and make it cool. We could float 12 different kinds of cities up there. The question is, does it fit the narrative and support the narrative? And I think what's clear here is this is a very sort of European look, and it would directly fight the narrative of American exceptionalism.
And what is it saying also? I mean, the thing is with, once you have the narrative of American exceptionalism, you can actually say something about it. Whereas I think something we struggled with before we hit that was, what are we saying? Right?
Yeah, like I was just going through, I was reading a book about the art development of the Disney film Tangled, and you see all these early images, and you're like, they threw that away, they threw that away, they threw that away, and you can't kind of believe it. But then when you think about actually trying to make a coherent vision that tells a specific story that resonates throughout the entire thing, there's lots of great art you can make, a lot of great art these guys can make, and we're fortunate that these guys can make great art just, in their sleep. But is it part of a larger narrative you're trying to tell?
And I think for us as artists, sort of independent even of that, is that we want to grow with each project. And if it really was, can you go back to the art director image, the slide
The old
7?
one. Yeah.
As predicted.
What?
We are returning
Yes.
to the napkin.
Yeah, if it really was like this, we'd be so fucking bored that we wouldn't know what to do. I mean, the other thing is that I think that, because we like to push ourselves each time, what's interesting about this drawing is this is a lie we tell ourselves every time we start a game.
Yeah.
We go, okay, well, Bioshock worked, and you know what we're just going to do? We're just going to take it and throw it up in the air, and everything will work fucking perfectly. And you have to tell yourself that lie, or you'll never make the game.
It's too scary otherwise.
And I think it's evolutionary. Like, I think somewhere, like, if you go to the dawn of man, there was a cave where there was elders sitting around. They're like, you know what? Today we're going to hunt a buffalo. It's pretty much a big raccoon. So we're just going to do what we do in raccoon hunting, like more. We'll do more of it. Obviously, no one would leave the cave. So, so we can leave the cave. We have to convince ourselves of this for a short period of time. And then, 2 weeks after actually putting that house in the clouds, you're like, oh, we've made a terrible mistake and we have to finish this.
Yeah, because you saw that previous image, all those clouds closing in makes it just like the ocean. In fact, all the colors we were using, there's all these purples and greens originally in our original work because that was comfortable for us.
And Ken was like, to some degree it came from you. You're like, you're punting. You're not taking on the sky. And
I was part of that punting.
Yeah,
I mean,
We all were.
you guys.
Everybody was.
And I think, but when we can crystallize around an idea, it energizes us, but also it introduces a huge amount of risk. I mean, look, doing another Rapture game would have been a lot less risky for us. And who knows? The thing isn't done yet. Who knows? We could totally blow it. But I think that's why we like working with each other, is because we challenge each other and we keep introducing risk into the process. And Bioshock 1 was risky.
So you've got some basic vision set up. You've gone through some experiments like this. This was another sort of interim image that you showed me where you're really starting to play with that, holy cow, we're actually in the sky, and this is altitude. How does this change the gameplay design, right? Because now all of a sudden, even in the trailer footage that we've seen, or in some of the gameplay footage that you've shown, a lot of that, you're still running around on a floor, a lot of it.
Can I just say one thing about this image? If you look at the moment where the guy's thrown out of the window in the trailer, that's the concept. That was the original concept image. And if you held it up to the image, it's a color. It's primarily a palette change. All the sky turns sunny and blue. The purples disappear. The colors of the flags get brought up. We had this image, and we actually sent this to Blur, who was helping us, build that trailer, and this is before we really were able to transition from the Nouveau stuff.
Yeah, this image perfectly shows us straddling the two styles, which is that, we have this sort of European Art Nouveau kind of, it's a dark, foggy Paris night with the beginnings of the sun in the background and the beginnings of the flag in the foreground.
But the flags are kind of hidden.
And then we just had to take the slider and just slam it to one side. But this is one of those fundamental moments in development.
To answer your question, Julian, about the sky, something that's really important to us with this game is that Look, I'll be honest. Bioshock being underwater is a bit of a cheat, right? It's basically a bunch of what we call skyboxes out to the water, which are, you see these tableaus, and you can't go out there, and the water doesn't really affect the world. It was really moody and I think worked really well there, but we never paid that off. I think one of the challenges we gave ourselves with Infinite is saying, well, if you're going to be in the sky, what does that mean? What does that mean for how the city's laid out, for the scale of the city? What does that mean for moving around the city? What does it mean for feeling, how do you get that feeling of vertigo? How do you get that feeling of this thing could fall out of the sky at any time? And try to actually pay that stuff off in gameplay. And that's something we struggled with for a long time. And those elements were much trickier to come on because in Bio 1, it was really just an art. The ocean was really just art.
Right. And now we're taking on the task of, I could be standing on a roof looking 100 yards, 200 yards down below me, and I can get down to that park down there or that street down there. And how do we get you down there in an interesting way? Is that we start thinking artistically about, we don't want to put miles of stairs in this game. So how do we get people down there and start thinking creatively about getting people moving around the city?
And doesn't it put a tremendous burden on the flow of the game to make sure that the players, even looking in the right place? When you start adding things like altitude, and we see that in some of the gameplay footage you guys have shown, where you've got guys up here shooting down at you, and guys down here launching cannons from a city block that's way over there. And how do you start integrating those elements into the design of the art itself? What are there tricks you use to get people to look out that window?
We like making things easier.
Are there? Do you know any?
Yeah, if you know any, those would be awesome. This is probably a good place to talk about. You talk about that demo, and we don't give away all our secrets, but we learn a lot from our own demos. We set a high bar for ourselves, I think, with a certain set of, we know when we're going to have to be done with that demo, and we know there's going to be a bunch of questions that have to be answered. And so when we release them to the public, it's a great way to have to drill down and figure out things. That first demo, be honest with you, that's when we figured out how the city was going to be laid out. A lot of trial and error, a lot of experimenting with what is the right building size, what is the distance, what's it going to be like when buildings are just sort of free floating and moving, what's possible, what do these skyline things look like, how do they work, how do they sound.
How does it feel to ride them? How do we make that exciting? How do we integrate that into gameplay?
Do we want to show that video now? We can do that. The skyline.
The skyline.
Oh yeah. Well, is that the early album?
This is how the sausage is made here. This is like Justin Sonic built this with programmer art, and this is just like him hacking around and trying to make it work. This is the first thing we did is what is it like to be on these rails? And look, it's not pretty, it's not polished, it's not anything, but this is where we start with things. You can run that video.
Let's hope it actually works.
So we start working on. So we start.
Well, when the art team gets this from JSonic, we have an absolute heart attack because
that's the part you don't see. It's like you're like, great skylines. What am I in a fucking grain silo? I can't make a city out of this. It's absolutely ridiculous, and
And that's a challenge. It's like, so we have this game system we want to make, but for a Bioshock game, skylines need to feel like part of this city. So we talk about, because what we started talking about is like, if you have a city where you have these basically floating islands, how would people get around it? How would they move freight around it? How would they transfer things around it? I think you know from playing our games that we wanted, when we built Rapture, as ridiculous as it is, with these big daddies and little sisters walking around and all these splicers running around, we wanted to feel like it's a place that was believable in its own context and within the rule set we had. And so, we started talking about, well, we know we wanted these skylines from a gameplay standpoint. It's like, well, how would they work in the city? So we started doing things like, well, they would probably they'd probably transport, cargo around on these things. So we started putting lines where you can see these cargo containers hanging from them. We want to feel like there's places that people are actually using these things within the city, because sometimes there's no other way to get around in a city that's structured like this. And so it's really important to us that it not feel like, a Ratchet and Clank thing, which is, and when you start with prototype like that, you see something that's very cool from a gameplay perspective, and you can start to see the possibilities of fighting on those things and jumping off and shooting things. But we then have to make sure it feels part of Columbia and integrated into Columbia.
It needs to tell a story. Why are they there?
Yep.
They're not just these designer drawn out splines. Like, they have to either be there for transportation or there for the cargo, like Ken says. Do we have the video of the straight line?
I can go dig it up. I can go dig it up if you want to look at that.
We have it.
I think that, this is a good evolution to show, like, when Justin comes to us with that map and it's pure design and it's pure jumping around and navigating, then it comes to the art team and we have to think about, like, well, how do we make this fun and how do we make it visceral?
And believable.
Like, how do you make you feel like when you're on this thing, it's dangerous and, you're holding on by the seat of your pants. So this preview coming up will be like our first attempt at showing that. Quick.
Sean put that together, and we were like, "Oh yeah, we can do this. This will be amazing."
And if you think about that, so much of that is like, it's the same thing, but it's aesthetic and the sound effect. Like we work with the sound, like this is like being on a roller coaster, but you're hanging in midair and you've got a fucking gun. And so the sound effects of the wind coming by you and the thing shaking. I mean, if you've ever been on like an old like turn of the century wooden roller coaster, there's nothing like it. And so that was where we started, and making it feel visceral and making it feel real. And look, we're still figuring out some of this and making and making it work and controlling right. But that's we have a term we call player RAM at the that we use called player RAM, which is like how much can the player keep in his head and without like his brain exploding. And the skylines are really challenging because it's so visceral and there's so much going on. And so our challenge right now is like we have this huge level of excitement. It's now getting it in within player RAM so people can actually play it and master it and feel really powerful on it. And that's what we're doing now.
Yeah. So as a combat mechanic, that's all cool. I mean, I was excited when I saw that video, and I could have just imagined the feeling of jumping and doing all that. But how do you start designing story and sort of objectives and bringing somebody through a world like that? I mean, Rapture, or really any of your games, while it may not have been linear, at least I could play D&D nerd and map it all out on graph paper. How the heck do you map something like that out on graph paper to tell somebody they need to get from point A to point B and they might die in the middle?
Again, a wonderful question, Julian.
I don't know if we have graph paper back at the office.
A lot of it is we spend a lot of time talking about, because we don't do cutscenes. That's not our thing. And we spend a lot of time talking about how do we draw the player's attention? Where is he looking? And we do a lot of thinking about that. Like we have some very stupid rules. Like we have a rule of a T, which is like if you want somebody to see something and they're walking this way, don't put it to their side. It's put it at a T intersection. If you go back and play Bioshock, you'll start to be like, oh my God, they did this over and over and over again. Because we don't have the cutscenes. We want people to see things. So we constantly be moving stuff. Like a level builder would build something that's on your side. We'd put it in front. There's a million ways, and I think Valve is really the master of this. Like we looked at, when we were building Bioshock, we looked at There's a scene with you and Alex and was it the robot and dog? Was that the name of the robot?
Yeah. Okay.
And the dog, and all the stuff's going on, and they do all these tricks to draw your eye to various places, and you can do that with color. Sound is a little tricky because it's very hard to position sound in the world. Movement and color are your primary things, and so you have to do is you have to think about your overall movement and color palette, de-emphasize certain areas and emphasize other areas. And
Strangely enough, we look a lot at theater as opposed to movies when we're blocking these things out, because if somebody's in an audience, you want to draw their eye to a part of the stage. You don't really have control of a camera and saying, look over here. You have to make them interested.
If you think about the sequence in Bio 1 where you encounter Andrew Ryan, you come into a room, he's basically on a stage, right? He's on the side of this glass. And you come in, the lights are down where he is. Like, think about going into a theater. The lights are up where you are. We slowly bring the house lights down, and we bring the lights up on Ryan. And that's all, and for a while his office was way more complicated. We started pulling elements out of his office because it's all about focusing on him, getting the player's attention on him. And so we kept pulling stuff out and using the transition in the lighting. And this is a much bigger challenge because you're not in a small room. You're often in these huge spaces. But the techniques are, they expand to accommodate. It's just a little more difficult.
So we've talked a lot about the broad scope challenges, and I mean that in a geographic sense. These big worlds we're flying around in and dealing with the sky and making people look really far away. But one of the things that I associate with irrational games is actually not that so much is the little stuff. And when I mean little stuff, I mean like you lift something up and there's something written underneath a box, kind of little stuff. When does that enter the process? When do you start filling the world with all that stuff that is kind of, I sort of think, signature of an irrational game?
Well, I'll say this. We have this conversation all the time, and, we'll be sitting, Scott and I have this, we all have this conversation. We'll be building this entire city, like 10-block area of city, and we're like, dude, all I want to do is spend 9 hours, like, decorating an office, like the tiniest possible space, and being like, it's like playing with dolls. You're like, oh my God, but wait, if we could put a little pipe here, like it just went out, and like there's still a little smoke coming out of it. Like, we absolutely adore doing that stuff. It's our favorite thing. Like, it's so much more fun than building an entire city. But, thinking about a character and going to his personal space, bedroom or office or something like that, and just drilling down deeper and deeper and deeper narratively with small, like, ephemera, like what magazines does he read, is he organized, is he disorganized, all those things. But I would say it generally tends to come really late because you need a ton of assets to do it. And it takes an entire game's worth of artwork before you have enough to make a room look realistically full and, and really something you can dig into.
And sometimes it takes us that long to really discover who the character is.
Yeah.
So, we spend a lot of time with that character through the development of the story and through the game. And by the time we're ready to really add that mise-en-scène into the spaces, we really have a full understanding of who that character is.
And we know exactly what should be in their space or in that space when we're talking about.
If you can make people believe in these small little elements, they'll buy into your big fantastical nonsense. The reason I think people bought into Rapture is because you go into somebody's living room and it felt like somebody's living room, and you believe the people living there, even though they were shooting fireballs out of their hands, because you saw their living room. And that's I think that's something we've always wanted to do since back in the days of System Shock 2 with the very crude tools we had. We try to make that ship believable. That when you're on the Von Braun, it feels like a place that, instead of giant. I was about to say giant crates, and there's a fucking crate.
Sorry, my bad.
Time to crate, 0.
We. Can you go back to the pool table, please? This is back in the days of Doom and Quake, and so even these small little nods made the spaceship. We put potato chips and stuff around, and bottles of booze, and
yeah. We had no resolution, right? At this time, we could put nothing on screen. We could put a box and slap texture on it because that's where performance was. But if you look, and it's around, it's not generally on the critical path. But if you go into somebody's office on the Von Braun, and you'll find that like tucked behind the desk is some porn and some booze and some, and we'd think about that
Also at
individual
Irrational,
guy.
yeah.
Also at Irrational, there's a good deal of that. We'd think about that guy, and like if his log made him out to be, kind of unstable, kind of a derp, we'd make sure his office like represented that, and we'd have to do it with 3 or 4 objects. Now we can do it with hundreds,
Right.
Well,